Okay, so today will be a really short tutorial. We're just discussing how to apply materials and textures to our objects so that you could prepare your scene for rendering. So um, first off, make sure everything's pretty much organized in your layers. It's a lot easier to apply your materials when things have been placed into their um, proper layers, and so that you can continually update your model and ensure that materials are kept or applied to the layer that they're placed onto. So as you can see, I have my four objects placed into this metal layer and these three objects placed into the wood layer. So everything's categorized where they need to, identified by the type of material that they'll um, have applied to them. So we have our material palette amongst our properties, layers, etc. And if you can't find that, you could select this gear to the right and it should show up here. So have that checked and you'll have your material palette. Okie dokie. I'll switch to rendered view. So I'll right click this and select rendered. As you can see, there's no materials applied to our objects. They're just blank canvas right now. So to add a material, we'll go to this plus sign and there's a few options. We can import from a library that Rhino has, a bunch of different materials that we'll look into. And then there's a few custom templates to which you can modify and really customize on your own. We'll select one from the library for now. As you can see, there's a bunch of different items from plastic to metals. So there'll be a lot of choices for you to choose. I'm going to select one from architectural, floor, and wood. And feel free to choose any one of these. I think I'll select floor, wood, dark, and open. And now we have our material loaded into our material section, but not yet applied. So a few things we can do before applying is look to its settings. There's some slider scales related to its gloss, reflectivity, transparency that you could adjust, and that should update in the preview above or in the thumbnail above. So play around with these, and when you're ready to apply your material, simply right click on the material thumbnail, and there's one of four options that we could choose. We can assign it to a specific object. So I can select this box here and right click and assign to this object. And now it has our material applied. I can right click it and assign it to the layers. So in this case, I want to assign it to all our objects in wood. And the benefit of doing it by layer is, should I create a new object within this wood layer, I'll create another box. It should already have our texture applied to it. So that's one of the streamlined benefits of applying materials to layers, is that you don't have to apply it again. It's already there. And when you unassign from a layer, just be aware that if you've assigned it to an individual object, then it'll remain. So I right-clicked that and applied our materials. And okay, so this is our wood floor, but it doesn't really look like a wood floor. And the problem with adding materials to objects is that you sort of have to map it out and ensure that your scale, your rotation, and how it's placed onto the object is adjusted as well. So in this case, it's definitely not adjusted to the dimensions of this box. In order to do that, we have to adjust its mapping. And what I mean by mapping, so if we go down to the textures section, we can select this image that is the wood floor that we're applying to our object. and we're going to adjust it so that we can modify it in another panel. So right now, if we go to mapping, it's on WCS option, but we want to change it to mapping channel. And so already it's looking a lot better. It's at a more appropriate scale to our objects. And then we'll head to properties. And so when you select your object with a material applied to it, you'll have a few more options open. One of them we'll look at is texture mapping. So when I select texture mapping, I have now the ability to change a few parameters regarding its offset, its repeat, and rotation. You won't really have to pay attention to the X, Y, Z settings. We're really only looking at the UVW options. And UVW is basically just directions that are applied to, oops, I lost it, applied to the object in order for it to orient our bitmap image onto the object. So here now we can play around with these values. So I could adjust its rotation, for example. And I find that it's a bit difficult to know which one is which. So I go around one by one to see how it's affected. And in this case, it's not working because we have a box item, but we're trying to change our bitmap based off like a planar image. So it's like we need to find a way to apply this mapping to this 3D object. So there are a few options at the top. If it were a planar surface, say just one side, then we can click this planar mapping button and that would apply to just that surface. But because we have a box, we want to apply it to the mapping to a box. So now there's a few command options that we could adjust or create our, I guess, framework or scaffolding for this mapping. So we're essentially going to recreate this box now. And do we want it capped? Yes, we do. And now this mapping is, I guess, attuned to the shape of this box. So I can now adjust these, and this should probably take on the angle now. Yeah. Okay, so in this section, I can adjust the rotation of our map. So I turned it 45 degrees. I could turn it 90 degrees. Here we can see this, just the scale of it. So I could repeat it in the U direction. And so our bitmap image will start to be squished or shrink. And I could change it in the other direction. It'll start to look really squished now. Okay, and this works for more irregular surfaces. So in this case, I could either choose surface mapping or let's see, cylindrical mapping. That might also work pretty well. And again, we're going to recreate a cylinder in order for the image to form or wrap onto the object appropriately. So I'm selecting my center, and if I have my O-snap on with center applied, it should be quite easy, but I'm still having trouble. Okay, where's the center? No, it doesn't want to stick. Okay, we'll approximate it because no. So strange. Okay, yeah, we'll approximate it. Capped, we want yes. So now our mapping has can apply to this lofted object more appropriately. And then we have the same sort of options to modify it further.
Eric, there's a question about adding elements to these objects. Let's say one of those rectilinear boxes is one of their small buildings, and they add a balcony. How do they make the balcony out of a different material?
Okay, so I think this is a question related to layers then. So if you're going to have a different object of a different material, then I suggest first to create a new layer. So I created a sublayer from this parent layer, and I could label that as your balcony. And your balconies all will have their own specific material applied to it. So firstly, I would organize your Rhino model in that sense. And then from there, in your material palette, you'll select a new material, either through the library or through the templates in which you could adjust. So let's just use glass, for example. And we can adjust its clarity and color, etc. And with this new object in, well, I'll make this object in this layer. So with this new object, say these are your balconies now, and you apply the material to that layer. So I'll assign to layers, and now your balcony layer should have this glass material. Does that answer the question? Will that be under the same layer of textures? Yeah, so you just have to ensure that you're organizing your model and all its elements and components into layers or folders that will take common material. So your balconies might be one material. It might be the same as maybe your parapet walls. So you could organize them into the same layer so that they take on the same material, or you could separate them into two different layers and just ensure that the materials are applied to both layers. So it's up to you to decide how to organize your layers, and thus your material will be organized in the same manner. On one surface of the box. So somebody is asking, how can we adjust the material texture on just one surface of the box? So yeah, I showed you how we can adjust it to the whole object, but if we want one surface, we'll have to explode our box so that they're broken up into multiple surfaces and thus multiple objects. And when we go to our properties panel in the texture mapping section, then we could apply either a surface mapping or a planar mapping to that one surface. So in this case, I'll try planar mapping, and like the box option, we're going to draw our plane. And in this case, we'll select UV. Basically, that's two directions, and because this is a 2D object, we'll only need two directions. And now that we have our mapping directions applied to the surface, then we can start adjusting the parameters. So I've changed the angle to 45. We can scale it down by increasing the values of our repetition, or we can half it by making the values smaller. And thus the mapping will become bigger. Okay, and are there any more questions? This is basically it. We looked at how we can organize our layers so that we can apply materials to selected layers and identifying them as well. Then we created our materials. We took them from the project library that Rhino has, and we adjusted their mapping image in the texture section so that we've changed the option from WCS to mapping channel, and that gives us the freedom to adjust their rotation, scale, and placement on our objects. And then from there, we look to the properties panel under the texture mapping, where we focused on the UVW options. And these options allow us to, as I said, offset, repeat, or rotate our mapping. And in order to do that, we sort of have to create a framework in which Rhino can understand how that mapping is applied to our objects. So the options that we could choose from are surface mapping, that pretty much applies to any surface, and then more custom mappings like planar, which is great for flat surfaces, box mapping, which we did with our 3D objects, and cylinder, which although this isn't a cylinder, it pretty much has the same geometry. So we have applied our mapping in that sense as well. And then from there, we can adjust our parameters.
Eric, we have a question. Students are wanting to know how to change one plane into a mapped with another material. For instance, the one that you exploded, they would like to put a roof color on that one, just as
a yeah, like we can go ahead and head to our materials panel, and I'll select a new object again. So import. Let's try a paint object. Avocado. Okay, so now we have our material. Because I've exploded this, it's its own separate object. And although it's taking the texture from our layer, we can basically overwrite it because we're going to assign it specifically to this object. And so this object will be in our wood layer, which has a material assigned to it. But as I stated before, any object that has a material assigned to it specifically, that will override the layer material. So that's just something to be cautious about as well. If you're trying to adjust all these and they are in the same layer, but because one has a material specifically applied to it, you'll have to change that as well.
That's great. Let's see if there's other questions in the chat. Oh, the students are asking about cutting into the building, which isn't really part of this lesson, but you did this in a previous lesson. You showed about cutting and joining shapes and using one shape to cut into another shape.
Okay, yeah, so just a review on last week's tutorial about Boolean operations. Our Boolean commands are found in the solid tab and in this last section. So we have a few different options. We can union our objects together, meaning we're adding two or more objects to make one. And in this case, the question is, how can we cut into our building? We can use the difference command. So I didn't really set up this properly. With the difference command, we're taking two or more objects and we're using one of the objects to cut into the other. So my analogy was you have an apple and you're biting into the apple. So one object will become the apple and one object will be us taking a bite out of it. So in this case, I want to remove a portion of this building using this object, and our larger object will remain. So in our Boolean difference command, our first object will be the object we'll subtract from. We'll hit enter. And our second object will be the object we subtract with. And enter, and you've got yourself a fancy smanchy hole in a box. So that's basically the Boolean difference command in a nutshell.
Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Great, great. Well, that's a wonderful mini lesson that I think students can really take to heart. Be careful with your textures. You can get into trouble making things look kind of hokey, like they're in some kind of online computer game, and you don't really want that. Do look at examples from ArcDaily, etc., to see how architects suggest materials by desaturating them quite a bit, or using a color rather than making it look like it's hyper realistic. So be careful with your textures. You can go a little overboard the first time you use them with the joy and fun of applying everything everywhere.